If you're like many young Earth creationists, you probably had a short course on evolution in high school, perhaps taught by a teacher who didn't actually believe in evolution herself. Apart from that, you've likely heard from trusted sources like your parents and your church, from books like Of Pandas and People and Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, and from websites such as Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries that evolution can't possibly be true. You've probably even heard claims that evolutionary theory isn't even scientific. So why is it that so many scientists, the very people most educated and best equipped to evaluate scientific evidence, believe the evolutionary explanation? An amazing 95% of all scientists do. But even that number includes chemical engineers, computer scientists, physicists, and other scientists without expertise in fields related to evolution. If you look at just the experts in the relevant life and earth sciences, like biologists, geologists, and paleontologists, the number skyrockets to an astounding 99.85%. That's almost 999 out of 1,000 relevant scientists who accept evolutionary theory as the only viable explanation for the diversity of species. How can that be? Creationists will often claim that scientists conspire against creationism, or that researchers only say evolution is true so they can get funding for research, or that major scientific journals refuse to publish creationism articles. But such claims only reflect ignorance of how the business actually works. A conspiracy would require the concerted effort by almost all of the millions of scientists living throughout the world. And even if there were any reason to pressure scientists to support evolution regardless of the evidence, making unfounded and false claims will ultimately ruin a scientist's reputation, since there are plenty of other scientists in the world who can and will test those claims. That's why there are relatively few scientific hoaxes. Sooner or later, other scientists test the data and discover the fraud. It's built into the scientific method. Furthermore, a scientist's success is hardly dependent on accepting evolutionary theory. In fact, anyone who can prove the theory false would be guaranteed fame and prestige, and likely even a Nobel Prize. And the reason creationism articles don't get published by reputable science journals is that creationists have submitted almost no articles for publication, and the few that are submitted fail to meet the rigorous standards required for publication. The research must be impeccable, and all claims must be supported by the evidence. The fact is, there is simply no evidence for creationism. None. That's why there aren't any creationism articles in scientific journals, and why teaching creationism in science classes has been rejected by landmark rulings all the way up to the Supreme Court, and why almost no scientists accept creationism as valid. But science isn't about accepting a theory simply because an opposing position fails to meet the scientific standard. So what is it about evolution that has convinced virtually all relevant scientists? Well, for a theory to be scientific, it must make testable predictions that could prove the theory false, and those tests must be reproducible. You start by asking the question, if this theory is true, what evidence should we see as a result? Evolutionary theory states that all species descended from a common ancestor through the process of natural selection, acting on variation within populations. So if the theory is true, what evidence should we see? When Charles Darwin first postulated the theory, he had essentially no knowledge of genetics or of the age of the Earth, and the fossil record was slim at best. Yet based on his theory, he concluded that all species must be constructed on a common pattern which is subject to random modification, that the Earth must be ancient for life to have had the time necessary to evolve to its present state, and that not only would the fossil record be sorted by lineage, but that it would contain transitional forms that possess characteristics from both ancestral and descendant species. These were fundamental predictions that would prove evolutionary theory false if they turned out to be wrong. Since then, we've discovered that all species are indeed built upon a common pattern, DNA, which is frequently modified through mutation. In fact, each of us has 100 to 200 mutations not possessed by our parents, We've also discovered multiple lines of evidence proving the Earth is ancient, 4.6 billion years old, in fact, and we found that the fossil record, which is now far more complete than it was in Darwin's time, is indeed sorted by lineage. Never once do we see humans appearing before dinosaurs, for example. And we've discovered numerous transitional forms. In fact, just 2 years after Darwin published his theory, a perfect example of a transitional form was discovered, Archaeopteryx. This species possessed a bony tail, fingers with claws, jaws with teeth, and other characteristics found in theropod dinosaurs, while also possessing wings, flight feathers, a wishbone, and other characteristics found in birds. Such is the predictive power of evolutionary theory that scientists looking for a transitional form between fish and four-legged animals, known as tetrapods, were able to determine exactly where to look in the fossil record. They then went out and found the fossil remains of Tiktaalik, a species with the fins and gills of fish, along with the primitive lungs and weight-bearing wrist bones and fingers of tetrapods. Archaeopteryx and Tiktaalik are just two examples, but paleontologists have discovered many dozens of well-defined transitional forms, all supporting evolutionary theory. Creationists like to point out that transitional forms are assigned to existing taxonomic categories instead of between them, thus implying they aren't actually transitional. For instance, Archaeopteryx is classified as a bird. The problem with that claim is that all transitional species are assigned to existing higher-level taxonomic categories. We don't have a category for something between dinosaur and bird, so Archaeopteryx had to be assigned to one or the other. Creationists also point out that there's no way to know for certain if a particular fossilized species is the direct ancestor of a later species, which is true, but also entirely irrelevant. The fact that fossils possessing characteristics from both the ancestral and descendant species can be successfully predicted to be located in a specific area of the geological column is powerful evidence in favor of evolutionary theory. What would be the odds of actually making such finds if evolution were not true? To put it into creationist terms, it would be like predicting the location of Noah's Ark, that it would be carbon dated to 4,000 years old, and that it would be filled with fossilized dung from thousands of different species, and then going out and finding exactly that. Good luck. Furthermore, if the young Earth creationist claims of a 6,000-year-old Earth where all fossils were created by the Great Flood were true, why would there be so much evidence indicating a far older planet? And why is the fossil record sorted by lineage, something that couldn't possibly occur by flooding? All this is only a tiny fraction of the evidence for evolution and against creationism. So in the face of all this evidence, why do creationists continue to maintain their belief? Why do they mislead people with quote mining, strawman arguments, arguments from ignorance, and other fallacies? Actually, all you have to do to find out is go to their main websites and check out their statements of faith. Scientific theories are based on evidence, but as you can see here, creationists put religious faith before evidence, even to the extent that they willingly ignore any evidence that contradicts their faith. That's not just bad science, it's dishonest. So the next time some preacher, Bible studies teacher, or even someone with a PhD in philosophy tells you creationism is true and scientific, while evolution is false and unscientific, just remember what virtually all life and earth scientists have concluded. The very experts most equipped to understand the science regarding the origin of species, whose very work depends on accurately interpreting the data, conclude the evidence supporting evolutionary theory is overwhelming. And the evidence supporting young earth creationism is, well, there isn't any.